Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Juneteenth Lunch and Learn, June 18th, third Friday lecture. Today, we'll be hearing from Claudia Yvonne Heinemann-Priest, who's a linguist and faculty at the Native American Studies Center, who will be talking about Southeastern languages then and now and what is happening to those Southeastern Native or Indigenous languages. But before we get started, a couple of announcements. As always, Ashley Larimore and our public relations coordinator and Katie Scholl, our visitor coordinator, are behind the scenes, making sure that I don't mess this up and making sure everything runs smoothly and get you all into the Zoom and working with your questions. July 16th is our next Lunch and Learn, applying digital image analysis to low country colonialware. By John Marcoux and Corey Sates. Colonialware is a type of low-fired earthenware. It's similar to Catawba pottery, made by enslaved people on the plantations in the Carolina Low Country in the 18th century. And as you know, a lot of those enslaved peoples were natives. So this is kind of a combination of native and African folk tradition. And they're doing some kind of cool high-tech analysis that we'll be hearing about. Also, if you watch the video, apparently there wasn't sound, but our exhibits are going to be repopulated. Some of those exhibits that you saw are no longer there. And we're hoping to open back up to the public in August. Right now, if you'd like to come, you need to set an appointment just so we know you're coming, and we'll open the door and make sure that you're the only group that's there. And you can email Katie Scholl at our Native American Studies Center email to get information on that. So let me introduce my colleague, Claudia Yvonne Heinemann-Priest. Claudia is a linguist. She's very knowledgeable of the Catawba language, and to a lesser extent, she tells me other Southeastern or Eastern United States Native American languages. She holds a couple of master's degrees. She's got a master's in arts from the University of South Carolina. She has a master's in liberal arts from Winthrop University and is currently working on a PhD in comparative literature at the University of South Carolina, Columbia. I was just thinking, Claudia, that it was about 12 years ago, we took students to Greece for a summer tour and visit. It's hard to believe it's been that long, but so without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ashley and I'm going to hand it over to Claudia and let her take over. The floor is yours, Claudia. Welcome.
All right, thank you, Chris, for the introduction. Good afternoon. My name is, as Chris said, Claudia Heinemann-Priest, but just Claudia is fine. So welcome to another Lunch and Learn lecture, and I would like to thank all my colleagues at USCL and at the Native American Studies Center for making these presentations possible. I would also like to thank all Native Americans, American Indians, First Nations, Indigenous, and Aboriginal people of the world. All right, let's get started. So I favor the presenter view. So you will be able to see my current slide and the next slide that's coming. And you will also be able to see my notes if I have any here that I may or may not be reading from, and I'll kind of go aside and make some of my own comments here. But I tend to like to read off of a script so that I'm not digressing awfully much, and I don't hold you for more than an hour. So I'll be talking about the changed landscapes of Native American languages of the Southeast today. A language dies every 2 weeks. Linguist David Crystal has estimated that one language is dying out somewhere in the world on average every 2 weeks. At the time of Christopher Columbus's arrival, there were more than 15 million speakers of over 2,000 indigenous languages spoken across the entire Western Hemisphere. According to the Indigenous Language Institute, there were once more than 300 indigenous languages spoken in the United States, and approximately 175 remain today. In Canada and the United States, only about 500,000 native speakers of an Amerindian tongue remain. They also estimate that without restoration efforts, there will be at most 20 still spoken in 2050. So the Southeast as a culture and linguistic group is as shown by these two maps here. And I'll be showing you a lot of maps. And if you feel overwhelmed, even at the beginning of this presentation, but certainly towards the end, then I have done my job. So here's this is the Southeastern United States as it pertains to the linguistic culture groups. In terms of Native American languages and cultures, North America is divided as seen. Many of the native languages spoken being revitalized and or revived in the Southeast today involve a good deal of political nuances and cultural shifting. I am taking a historical linguistic approach based mostly on historical documents from archives and online resources. Ideally, language information, if available, comes from or is gathered from the people to whom the language belongs, which also can be a topic of hot debate. Before European contact, the American Southeast had a tremendous diversity of language. In South Carolina alone, at least 26 languages of 4 different language families, Algic, Iroquoian, Muskogean, and Siouan were spoken. Within 500 years, diseases, wars, migrations, voluntary and forced displacement had all but wiped out many spoken languages. Because of the great resilience of Native peoples, language revival and revitalization efforts continue to this day. The presentation today will explore the changed landscapes of Native American languages of the Southeast and the steps to preserve languages. So I'm going to take you through the different language families. Some of these are like macro language families, and others are mini or micro language families. Some of them are just considered language families. So we have a Siouan or Siouan Catawba, Catawban. So we add an N just to designate that it's a language family. So the map that you see is a pre-contact distribution of Siouan Catawban languages. Again, these are kind of reconstructions based on historical documents that we use since the first contact of the Europeans, and also by looking at what Native peoples have said. So records of researchers that write down what they say, but also we look at the histories of the Native people themselves, the histories that they recount today. So the Catawba or Carolina Siouan is what we a lot of times call them. It's a language family of North America that is located primarily in the Siouan language families. I'm jumping ahead here a little bit. The Siouan language families is a language family of North America that is located primarily in the Great Plains of North America, with a few outliers in the east. And here's a subdivision of how they are classified. We just love doing that as researchers. So we have the Western Siouan languages, and of those really, for the Southeast, we are concerned with Osage and Quapaw. So you see that Osage is extinct as a language, linguistically extinct as a language, but there is ongoing revival, and Quapaw apparently has 1 speaker. Then when we go down, we see the Ohio Valley Siouan languages like Virginia Siouan, Tutalosaponi, Missouri Siouan, Biloxi, and Ofo. Then you have the Eastern Siouan languages, which is the Catawba and Carolina Siouan that I was just talking about. So there's Catawba, which is considered linguistically extinct. And I'm going to talk about the distinction between what is Moribund, what is extinct, what is dead languages later. spoken by the Catawba language, and then you can see several of the dialects. So we have enough material that we have gathered from documents, from interviews, etc., that we know that there were several dialects of Isa, Chera, or Sarah. There is argument sometimes as to whether Chera was a dialect of Catawba or whether it was his own language, but that is a conversation for another day. Wakan is also considered linguistically extinct, spoken by the Waccamaw Siouan people. The Tutalosaponi language was a Siouan language of Virginia. The last fluent speaker died in the 1990s, and few Tutalos remember anything of the old language today. However, some Tutelo people are trying to revive their ancestral language for cultural purposes. The Saponi language has been extinct much longer, but is thought to have been a dialect of Tutelo, both from the similarity in vocabulary and from historical accounts indicating that people from the two tribes could understand each other without an interpreter. The main difference is that the Saponi dialect appears to have borrowed a number of vocabulary words from Southern Algonquin languages like Powhatan and a few from African languages. The Saponi Indians were known for sheltering African slaves. Now I've actually taken a look, since Catawban languages are kind of my specialty, and specifically Catawba itself, so mostly the Isa and the Chera dialects. I actually took this and spread it out a little bit more to show you all the various Catawban languages in the Southeastern languages. So you have Catawba, Chera, Chickasaw, Coffitacheki, and I will say some more words about that. Congaree, Kiawe, Pidi. It's also categorized as the language family of Muskogean, especially Beaver Creek Pidi, Santee, Sugaree, Waccamaw, Wateree, Waxhaw, Winyah. And we do have many alternate spellings that we see in some geographical locations in different documents that we found, where, you know, it depends on the researcher's native language, him or herself or themselves, whether the language, how the spelling of the language is written down. So if they have, say, French, if French is their main language, they wrote it down one way, using, of course, the phonology and the alphabet and the phonetics of their own language. We didn't start doing the IPA system until much later. So you can see here some of the meanings of the tribes. Next language family is the Iroquoian languages. So our main concern here, because it's the Southeast, is Cherokee and Tuscarora. So Tuscarora is actually part of the Northern Iroquoian, Lake Iroquoian, and then the Tuscarora Nottoway language families. So again, it's kind of, again, classifying the larger groups down to the actual languages. Both Tuscarora and Nottoway are considered extinct. Tuscarora is an Iroquoian language of the American Southeast. There were about 22 speakers in the United States and 8 in Canada around 2015. At that time, only a few elders still spoke the language, but some young Tuscaroras are trying to learn their ancestral language again. Tuscarora is recently extinct, the last fluent first language speaker having died in 2020. And of course, Southern Iroquoian, Cherokee, there are several dialects of Cherokee. The one that we are most familiar with is probably not the North Carolina dialect, but the Oklahoma dialect, because people-wise, like amount-wise, there are a lot of Cherokee people in Oklahoma, and we'll talk about a little bit about that displacement as well. but there is a North Carolina dialect, and there's also an Alabama dialect, and they often go by the Gidua. So Cherokee or Tsalagi, which is the more proper spelling of it, is an Iroquois language with an innovative written syllabary invented by a native Cherokee scholar. 22,500 people speak the Cherokee language today, primarily in Oklahoma and in North Carolina. Again, remember, those are two different dialects. Though it is one of the healthier Indian languages of North America and the one in which the most literature has been published, the Cherokee language is still in imperiled condition because of government policies as late as the 50s, which enforced the removal of Cherokee children from Cherokee-speaking homes, reducing the number of young Cherokees being raised bilingually from 75% to less than 5% today. Cherokee is the Creek word for people with another language. It's amazing how white settlers always manage to learn another tribe's name for any group of Indians. They learned the Creek word for the Cherokee tribe, but not the Creek word for themselves. Anyway, the original name for the Cherokee themselves was Aniunwia, but Cherokees find too, although they say Tsalagi. And I'm probably butchering the Cherokee language. I am not a Cherokee speaker. And even with my linguistic background, I do not profess to be able to pronounce things correctly. There are 350,000 Cherokee people today, mostly in Oklahoma, and of course in North Carolina. The best known episode in Cherokee history was also the worst, the Trail of Tears, which was the forced relocation of the native Cherokee Indians from their ancestral home in the Southeast to Oklahoma. The Cherokee people were an urban, Christian, agricultural, intermarried society who had supported the United States against other tribes. In the end, this was all for nothing. Though prominent Americans like Davy Crockett and Daniel Webster spoke against removal, and though the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional, President Andrew Jackson sent in the army. 15 to 20,000 Cherokee Indians, along with Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and other tribes, were rounded up and herded to Oklahoma in the winter of 1838 to 1839. Driven from their homes without being allowed to collect their possessions first, even their shoes, the Cherokee were no better equipped for an 800-mile forced march than people today would be. Between 4,000 and 8,000 people, Cherokee people, died of exposure, starvation, disease, and exhaustion along the Trail of Tears. Orrin Lewis, a tribal member of the Cherokee Nation, said, quote, "If you understand this, both the extent to which the Cherokee people had adopted American standards of civilization before the removal and the ultimate futility of it, you will go a long way towards understanding the Cherokee mentality today and also the attitudes of other Indian peoples towards us." Next language family, Algic/Algonquian. The Algonquian languages, also Algonquian, are a subfamily of American indigenous languages that include most languages in the Algic language family. Though these languages are more properly known as Algic to linguists, so the Wiyot and Yurok are not considered closely related enough to qualify as part of the Algonquian grouping, and the broader category Algic includes them as well. And it's not shown here on the map, but they're out here on the West Coast. Speakers of, I'm sorry, let me take a step back. I skipped something there. Algonquin, also spelled Algonquian, is the general term which is most often used by Native American people who speak them. A number of Algonquian languages, like many other Native American languages, are now extinct. Speakers of Algonquian languages stretch from the east coast of North America to the Rocky Mountains. The proto-language from which all of the language of the family descend, Proto-Algonquian, was spoken around 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. I'm trying to make it older. So again, these are just approximate dates. There's no scholarly consensus about where this language was spoken. So you can see here that as linguists, we divide up the Algonquian languages into Eastern, Central, Plains, California, Algic, and then we have some unattested. We think probably they were Algonquian. So of the Eastern Algonquian languages of interest to us are the Carolina Algonquian and the Virginia Algonquian, as well as the Shawnee. Beothuk, by the way, was spoken in the Newfoundland area up in Canada. So you can see that many of the Algonquian languages are considered extinct. The Central and the Plains tend to be a little bit more robust. And if you think about the history of the colonization of North America, that would make sense. In this map, you see the distribution of Carolina Algonquian speaking people and their tribal territories, specifically in North Carolina between 1657 and 1795. So this is where we come to a bit of a contentious issue when it comes to describing the languages and the people. So I'm going to stick to just describing the languages and what the languages are called, and I'm not going to make any kind of comments otherwise, because it is not my place, about descendants of many of these tribes. So Powhatan or Powhatan Confederacy was an Algonquian tongue known as Virginia Algonquian, once spoken by dozens of tribes in Tidewater, Virginia. None of the Powhatan dialects have been spoken natively for nearly 300 years, although 3,000 Powhatan people remain in Virginia and New England. The name Powhatan has caused a lot of confusion. Originally was the name of the town of Chief Wahunsunako that he came from. So he then took the name, united and or conquered much of what is now Virginia, and called his land the Powhatan Empire and himself Chief Powhatan. You know, English lords did much the same thing if you think about it. Modern day Powhatan trace their roots to this powerful but short-lived empire. The Powhatan Confederacy, which again was more of an empire or fiefdom, really, was made up of several Algonquian tribes united by an early 17th century ruler, Wahunsunako, better known as Chief Powhatan. Though Powhatan is known today primarily as the father of the highly romanticized heroine Pocahontas, in fact, he was a powerful leader who controlled most of eastern Virginia. The marriage of Pocahontas to a prominent Jamestown settler was meant to ensure peace between the Powhatan and the British empires, but she and her father both died prematurely, and after a few ill-fated attempts at a rebellion, the Powhatan Confederacy was destroyed by the British in 1644. Several of the original member tribes of the old Powhatan Confederacy, including the Pamunkey, the Mattapony, the Chickahominy tribes, still make their homes on their ancestral land in Virginia. Other Powhatan survivors fled northward to Pennsylvania and New Jersey and took refuge with survivors of the similarly decimated Lenape Nation. Their descendants live there together today to this day. Now, Powhatan or Virginia Algonquin is an extinct language belonging to the Eastern Algonquin subgroup of the Algonquian languages. It was spoken by the Powhatan people of Tidewater, Virginia. It became extinct around 1790s after speakers switched to English. The sole documentary evidence for this language is two short word lists recorded around the time of first European contact. William Strachey recorded about 500 words, and Captain John Smith recorded only about 50 words. Smith also reported the existence of a pidgin form of Powhatan, but virtually nothing is known of it. Like many Algonquian languages, Powhatan did not have a writing system, so all that is left are the recordings from the 17th century and the piecing together that can be done using related Algonquian languages. Strachey's material was collected sometime between 1610 and 1611, and probably written up from his notes in 1612 and 1613 after he had returned to England. It was never published in his lifetime, although he made a second copy, which is still available in manuscript format, in 1618. The second copy was published in 1849. The first was published in 1955. Smith's material was collected between 1607 and 1609 and published in 1612 and again in 1624. There's no indication of the location where he collected his data, his material. In 1975, Frank Siebert, a linguist specializing in Algonquin languages, who incidentally was the last linguist to speak to the last first speaker of the Catawba language. Anyway, he published a book-length study claiming the reconstitution of the phonology of the language. So he not only studied Algonquin language, he also studied Catawban languages. Powhatan loanwords in English. Siebert credited Powhatan with being the source of more English loans than any other indigenous language. Most such words were likely born very early, probably before Powhatan, before the conflicts arose, Powhatan English conflicts, in 1622. Among these words are chinkapin, chum, hickory, hominy, matchcoat, moccasin, muskrat, opossum, persimmon, pokeweed, pone, as in corn pone, raccoon, terrapin, tomahawk, and wikipi. So there you can see a little bit the linguistic etymology and history of how we came to use the word opossum, a white dog-like animal. And persimmon. So the final element reflects Proto-Algonquin, min, fruit or berry. The initial one is unknown. So we don't know where pesse or pushe or pessi comes from. We also have word lists of Powhatan that represent two dialects, so we know that there were at least two dialects. Although the language has become extinct, some of the tribes that were part of the Powhatan chiefdom still remain close to the lands, and I've already mentioned many of these before. These tribes include Nansemond, Chickahominy, Pamunkey, Patawomack, all of whom are recognized by the Commonwealth of Virginia. Although there are clear efforts to reclaim their culture, recultivation of their language is not at the forefront of their campaign. Now that may have changed, correct me if I'm wrong. There's also the Powhatan Lenape Nation located on the Rancocas Indian Reservation in Burlington, New Jersey, that is working to reclaim their culture and educate the public. The Pamlico or Pomook were a Native American people of North Carolina. They spoke an Algonquin languages also known as Pamlico or Carolina Algonquin. The Pamlico Indians lived on the Pamlico River in North Carolina. Named after them were Pamlico Sound, the largest sound in North Carolina, and Pamlico County. They're one of the most southerly Algonquin tribes on the Atlantic seaboard, and the most southerly one for which scholars collected a vocabulary. The language most commonly referred to as Lumbee was an Algonquin language known as Croatan or Pamlico, but the ancestors of modern-day Lumbee Indians also included speakers of several other languages, including Tuscarora, Catawba, Cheraw, and other Iroquois and Siouan languages. Little is known about today, so we don't know the Siouan languages that they may have spoken. We just suppose from research, from scant documents. English was used extensively among the Lumbee tribe, both as a practical lingua franca and also as a first language due to intermarriage with English speakers. And the original Lumbee languages fell into disuse and finally extinction. Now we come to the Muskogean language families. What is interesting about Muskogean is really that this is truly a southeastern language family, as you can see from the map. Spoken in the American Southeast, Muskogean languages included Eastern Muskogean language like Miccosukee, Creek Seminole, maybe Gwale, Central Muskogean language that included Southern Muskogean languages like Hichiti, Miccosukee, and Western Muskogean languages like Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Huma. Again, that's a little contentious. Alabama, Appalachia, Oconee, and Coasati. I think of all of those languages, only Appalachia is considered extinct, if I remember that correctly. There are also some lost or unattested or uncertain Muskogean languages. So Tuskegee, Yamasee, Ice, Jaga. Ice and Jaga were spoken in the Florida area. Today, Muskogee is spoken by several thousand citizens of the Muskogee Creek Nation, the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, and the Seminole Tribe of Florida. So I've included all of the states to which it is relevant, right? So we have Florida here, and let me make sure I get my states right. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. It's pretty sad that I have doubts about that. All right, Miccosukee or Creek language. Miccosukee or Muskogee, sorry, Muskogee or Creek is a Muskogean language of the American Southeast. I get confused because Miccosukee is also a Muskogean language. So Muskogee or Creek, let's just call it Creek. The language has been in decline, but some young people are working to keep their ancestral languages alive. There were 6,213 speakers in the US and worldwide in 2015. Like other Muskogean languages, Muskogee Creek is a language with a morphologically complex verbs and SOV word order. That means verb final. Incidentally, Catawba is also verb final. Muskogee or Muskokee or Creek is a living language spoken in Oklahoma and Florida. It was originally spoken in Alabama and Georgia. In the 1700s and early 1800s, some Muskogee speakers moved to Florida and became known as Seminoles. In the 1830s, most Muskogees and Seminoles were forced to move to Indian Territory. So you can see here the kind of what we believe to be the original homeland of the Muskogee Creek, moved down here, became known as Seminole. Some actually remained and hid in the forested areas in the swamps. Others were moved. Some moved directly. Some who remained here, they moved directly to what was considered then Indian Territory, and others were moved this way. So we now come to possible Muskogean languages like Gwale. So Gwale is a subset potentially of the Muskogee language. We have several examples, and a lot of these come from Laudonnière documents. He was a French explorer that was down in the Charleston area of South Carolina, the Savannah area of Georgia. So also Yamasee, let's take a look at Yamasee. Again, we are not entirely sure where this belongs in linguistic classification. The name Yamasee perhaps comes from Muskogee, Yumasa, meaning tame or quiet, or perhaps from Catawban, Ying Musi, which means literally people ancient. Little record remains of the Yamasee language. It is partially preserved in the works by missionary Domingo Baez. Diego Peña was told in 1716 to 1717 that the Tuskegee also spoke Yamasee. Hahn in 1992 claims that Yamasee is related to the Muskogean languages. This was based on a colonial report that a Yamasee spy within a Hichiti town could understand Hichiti and was not detected as a Yamasee. Francis Lejeau stated in 1711 that the Yamasee understood the Creek. He also noted that many Indians throughout the region used Creek and Shawnee as lingua francas. 1716 to 1717, Diego Peña obtained information that showed that Yamasee and Hichiti Miccosukee were considered separate languages. Inconclusive evidence suggesting the Yamasee language was similar to Guale rests on 3 pieces of information. A copy of 1681 Florida Mission Census states that people of Nuestra Señora de la Candelaria de la Tama speak la lengua de Guale y Yamasa, the Guale and Yamasee language. A summary of 2 1688 letters sent by the Florida governor mentions prisoners of the idioma Yiguala y Llamas de la Prova de Guale. So Prova is a short form of provincia. So the Yiguala and the Llamas languages are the province of Guale. And the Guale called the Cusabo Chiluque, which is probably related to the Muskogee word Chiloki, red moiety. I'm stumbling over my words here. I apologize. The Spanish documents are not originals and may have been edited at a later date. The name Chiluque is probably a loan word. It seems also have been absorbed into the Tuniqua language. Thus, the connection of Yamasee with Muskogean is unsupported. A document in a British colonial archive indicates that the Yamasee originally spoke Cherokee, an Iroquois language, but had learned another language. So there's that evidence as well there. If any of you are interested later on in some of the sources that I have cited here, please ask. I am more than happy to share those with you. Several sparsely attested languages have been claimed to be Muskogean languages. George Broadwell suggested that the language of the Yamasee and Guale were Muskogean. However, William Sturdivant argued that the Yamasee and Guale data were Creek and that the languages spoken by Yamasee and Guale people remain unknown. It is possible that the Yamasee were an amalgamation of several different ethnic groups and did not speak a single language. Chester B. de Prater describes the Yamasee as consisting of mainly speakers of Hichiti and Guale. The historian Stephen Otis also describes the Yamasee as an ethnically mixed group that included people from Muskogean-speaking regions, such as the early colonial era native towns of Hichiti, Coweta, and Cosita. The Pensacola and Chatot or Chakato people are reported to have spoken the same Muskegean language, which may have been closely related to Choctaw. Sparse evidence indicates that a Muskogean language was spoken by at least some of the people of the paramount chieftain of Coffetacheki in northeastern South Carolina. If so, that would be the most eastern outpost of Muskogean. The people of Coffetacheki were probably absorbed by nearby Siouan and Iroquoian speakers in the late 17th century. A vocabulary of the Huma may be another underdocumented Western Muskogean language or a version of Mobilian jargon. Mobilian jargon is a pidgin based on Western Muskogean. And incidentally, there are some words that we have collected from Catawba sources that indicate that some Catawba also used the Mobilian jargon. Again, if you're interested in these sources, please let me know. So we have this subgroup called Gulf languages, and it's kind of contentious because some people say there's no such thing. The Tunican Gulf languages were once spoken by tribes along the coast of Louisiana and Texas. Their descendants do not still speak these languages today, but from linguistic recordings, they appear to have been distant related to one another. They include Atacapa, Chirimacha, Natchez, Tunica, and possibly Gulf, Avoyelles, Biday, Opelousas, and Taensa. Many linguists also consider these languages to be distantly related to the Muskogean languages. So let's take a look at Tunica specifically. It was a Gulf language spoken in what is now Louisiana. The Tunicas have shared a reservation with the Biloxi since the early 1800s, though the true tribes were friends and allies, the languages were entirely unrelated. and being unable to communicate effectively in their native languages, both tribes shifted to French. The Tunica language, like other Gulf languages, has not been spoken for generations. Now let's talk about the Natchez. Natchez was a Gulf language spoken in what is now Louisiana. The Natchez tribe was destroyed by the French, and the survivors were later forcibly relocated to Oklahoma, where they were absorbed into the Creek and Cherokee tribes. Their descendants remain among those tribes to this day. But when the Natchez were driven out of their traditional homeland by the French colonists, a group of Natchez sought refuge with the Edisto area of South Carolina in 1735. In 1744, the Natchez left Fort Hall, South Carolina, fearing retribution by the Catawba for killing 7 members of their tribe. The Natchez sought refuge once again with other local tribes. These combined tribes have remained in the same area of South Carolina since the mid-1700s, calling themselves the Coosa Natchez. The Natchez originally lived in Mississippi, but were forced to leave at the hands of the French and their native allies. In 1744, it is assumed that the Natchez left the area known as the Pocket along the Edisto River in Colton County because of a history of fights with the Catawba, Waccamaw, and Petee tribes. This is not the case today, as the Natchez have a good relationship with the above tribal leaders. And there's my source for that. Like other Gulf Tunican languages, the Natchez language has not been spoken since the early 20th century, but some Natchez people today are working to revive the language. So that is the Natchez, South Carolina connection. The Taenza Indians were a small tribe of northeastern Louisiana, closely related to the Natchez tribe. The Taenza have not existed as a tribe since the late 1700s, but there are some people of the Taenza descent still living among the neighboring Chitimacha tribe today. A second Louisiana tribe, the Avoyelles, was sometimes called Petit Taenza tribe by the French, but actually was distinct from them. There are no remaining records of the Taenza language. A word list and a grammar of the Taenza language that were discovered in the 1880s by a French seminary student named Jean Parisot turned out to be an elaborate hoax. All that is known about the actual Taenza language is that early French missionaries considered it similar to Natchez, in which case it was probably also a Gulf language. Now, I mentioned the Avoyelles Indians. They were a small tribe of eastern Louisiana, relatives of the Natchez. They have not existed as a tribe since the late 1700s, but there are still some people of Avoyelles descent living in Louisiana today amongst the Tunica Biloxi Indians, and also in the Louisiana Cajun communities. So like I mentioned before, the Avoyelles, there's a different spelling for you, were called the Petit Taenza by the French. However, the Avoyelles and Taenza were actually distinct from each other. There are no remaining records of the Avoyelles language, but French missionaries considered it equivalent to Natchez, so it was probably either a Natchez dialect or a closely related Gulf language. So those are the big language families. We have some smaller language families, one called Coosabean languages. So Cusabo, Edisto, the South Carolina coastal tribes by Beaufort. There's evidence that at least 5 tribes on the coast in the territory from the lower Savannah to the Wando River east of Charleston spoke a common language that was different from the Guale and Siwi languages of the neighboring peoples. It is likely that the Ashapu, Combahee, Escamachu, Edouan, and Kiowa also spoke this language, which has been referred to as Coosabean. Only a few words, mostly town names, of this language were recorded in the 16th century by French explorer René Goulon de Laudonnière. One example was scorie or scary, meaning bad or enemy. It sounds a little bit like the English scary. Most words lack translations. Approximately 100 place names and 12 personal names in Coosabean have survived. The population estimates in 1600 was 3,200 for all tribes, so 3,200. And in 1715, it was 535 for all tribes. The Coosabean disappeared from the Palawana Island in 1738. In 1743, the Kiowa were given a grant of land south of the Combahee River, probably to be near the other coast Indians. By 1750, the tribes no longer existed. Surviving members most likely merged with the Catawba or the Creek of Georgia. The people themselves are noted in history as the first Eastern North American north of Florida, among whom European settlements were begun. Because remember, European settlements had earlier and longer contact with the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The Varnertown Indians are descendants of the Etowah and Edisto tribes, which are sub-tribes of the Casabo family of tribes. So we still have the Caddoan language, Caddo, and also the Arawakan or Maipurian languages. But let me talk quickly about a language isolate. I've listed 3 there, but let me talk just about Yuchi. So you see different spellings there. Yuchi is a language isolate, and that means a language that is unrelated to any other known language, kind of like Basque in Europe. Some linguists have suggested it might be distantly related to Siouan languages, but this has not been conclusively confirmed. The Yuchi languages is spoken only by a handful of elders today, but some young Yuchis are working to keep their ancestral language alive. Last I heard, there was one first language elder still alive speaking the language. So the Arawakan or Maipurian language actually are languages of the Caribbean, the West Indies and the northern coast of South America. So we have the Ta-Arawakan languages that I've mentioned there. So Taino is interesting to us because Taino, but also Timucua, was actually in Florida, as well as potentially Ice and Jaga. They were there, but we're not sure which language family they belong to. So Timucua is an extinct Amerindian language of Florida whose origins are uncertain. The language shows some similarities to the Arawakan languages, and linguist Julian Granberry has suggested the Timucua people may have migrated to Florida from an original Amazonian homeland. After being decimated by European disease and warfare between the Spanish and the British, the surviving Timucua Indians were sent to Cuba, where their language rapidly disappeared. The last known Timucua Indian died in 1767, making the Timucuans, along with the Beothuk, one of only a few truly extinct American Indian tribes. Now, I'm sure that there are descendants of Timucuans living in Cuba and other parts of the Caribbean. So I don't know what I would say they're truly extinct. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit about linguistically what it means to be a moribund language, an extinct language, and a dead language. So let's talk about language death. Why are these languages disappearing? Well, because of language death. Every 14 days, globally, a language dies. By 2100, more than half of the more than 7,000 languages spoken on Earth, many of them not yet recorded, may disappear, taking with them a wealth of knowledge about history, culture, the natural environment, and the human brain. There are 4 types of language death: gradual death, sudden death, radical death, and bottom to top death. Technically, there's another called top to bottom death, but that generally is considered part of gradual death. Campbell and Munsell distinguish 4 types, as I've just mentioned, but let me give you a little bit more detail on each of these. Gradual death involves the gradual replacement of one language by another. An example is the replacement of Gaelic by English in parts of Scotland. The most common process leading to language death is the one in which a community of speakers of one language becomes bilingual in another language and gradually shifts allegiance to the second language until they cease to use their original or heritage language. This is a process of assimilation, which may be voluntary or may be forced upon a population. Speakers of some languages, particularly regional or minority languages, may decide to abandon them based on economics or utilitarian grounds in favor of languages regarded as having greater utility or prestige. This process is gradual and can occur from either bottom to top or top to bottom. Sudden death is the rapid extinction of a language without the intervening period of bilingualism. The last speaker then is monolingual in the dying language, as with, for example, Tasmanian. Languages with small geographically isolated population of speakers can also die when their speakers are wiped out by genocide, disease, or natural disaster. Radical death is when a community stops speaking their language out of self-defense. For example, after the massacre of thousands of Indians in El Salvador in 1932, the speakers of the Cacaopera and the Lencia stopped speaking their language as not to be identified as Indians. Language deaths can be fast when the children are taught to avoid their parents' language for reasons such as work opportunities and social status. At other times, minority language survive much better, for example, when speakers try to isolate themselves against a majority population. Often, especially historical, governments have tried to promote language death, not wishing to have minority languages. Bottom to top death is when a language ceases to be used as a medium of conversation, but may survive in special use like religion or folk songs. For example, Celtal in Mexico only has a few older speakers in scattered villages, but survives in the register of prayer. Excuse me. So we do have language shift. Language shift happens all the time. It can happen in different types of registers. Language shift happens in the English language. When we have a new generation, they have different terminology for different things. The course of shift, though, in the initial phases of a relationship between two languages or two dialects, if you will, you can think about it that way as well. But specifically when we're talking about language, we're talking about two languages. They may show specific distribution patterns over specific domains. Public and formal domains may be allotted to the dominant language, with more informal and personal domains allotted to the minority language. The home, religion, folk songs, and tales are usually the last bastions of survival for the dominated language. There's no single set of factors that can be used to predict the outcome of language maintenance efforts, but factors that have caused the decline of certain languages can be grouped as economic changes, demography, institutional support, and status. Speaker competence in language shift. Speakers of a language that is in its last stages may exhibit a range of competence from full command to zero. Three types of speakers are distinguished. And give me 1 second, I need to take a quick drink here. Young fluent speakers have a native command of the ancestral language, but show subtle deviations from the norms of older speakers. Passive bilinguals are able to understand the ancestral language, but are unable to produce it themselves. Semi-speakers continue to use the ancestral language in an imperfect way. The term semi-speaker can be contrasted to the concept of the new speaker. So a new speaker relearns the language, not necessarily in a generational way. So, moribund, extinct, and dead. A language is often declared to be dead even before the last native speaker of the language has died. If there are only a few elderly speakers of a language remaining and they no longer use that language for communication, then the language is effectively dead. A language that has reached such a reduced stage of use is generally considered moribund. Once a language is no longer a native language, that is, if no children are being socialized into it as their primary language, the process of transmission is ended and the language itself will not survive past the current generation. This is rarely a sudden event, but a slow process of each generation learning less and less of the language until its use is relegated to the domain of traditional use, such as in poetry and song. Typically, the transmission of language from adults to children becomes more and more restricted to the final setting that adults speaking the language raise children who never acquire fluency. One example of this is the process reaching its conclusion is that of the Dalmatian language in the former Yugoslav nation. So an example of a dead language is Latin. A language is generally considered dead if there are no living descendants of that culture group. Now, you could argue for Latin that, well, what about Romance languages? Well, Latin developed into other languages. It became the mother of the Romance language in many ways. But technically, the Latin culture, right, the Roman culture, no exist exists as such. Therefore, Latin is considered a dead language. And the same is true for classical Greek, not modern Greek, but classical Greek. Extinct essentially means that the language is not spoken anymore on a day-to-day basis, but the descendants of the culture group still exist. And a moribund language, as I've described before there, is that it has a reduced stage of use. So that is the difference there between a moribund language, an extinct language, and a dead language. So what can we do? Steps to preserve a language or languages. The best non-linguists can do in North America towards preserving languages, dialects, vocabularies, and the like is, among other possible actions, participating in associations which in the US and Canada work to obtain from local and national governments a recognition of the importance of Indian languages that were prosecuted and led to quasi-extinction during the 19th century, and cultures, right? So not just languages, but also cultures. The two go hand in hand. You cannot really keep those two apart. They inform each other. So such as those of the Algonquin, Athapascan, Haida, Na Dene, Nootkan, Penutian, Silesian, Tlingit communities, to name just a few. So this is another thing that we could do. Participating in funding the creation of schools and the appointment and payment of competent teachers. I always advocate because there shouldn't be an or, we should do all of these things. Participating in the training of linguists and ethnologists belonging to Indian tribes in order to foster the publication of grammars and dictionaries, which should also be financially helped. Or acting in order to introduce the knowledge of Indian cultures as one of the important topics in American and Canadian TV and radio programs and internet. So this is something that French linguist Claude Hageg said. I wholeheartedly agree with him. And there are my sources as well. And to the abrupt ending of silence.